Welcome to Life, Love and Light. I'm Veronica Mary Rolfe, and in this second season of our podcasts, we're exploring a fascinating variety of biblical mystics. These men and women faced major challenges and crises in their lives. They made some really big mistakes, and they even committed gross misdeeds. They were forgiven, received mystical revelations, and then dared to act on those revelations. Their stories may become powerful inspirations for us in our own time of crisis, danger, fear, and spiritual uncertainty. Last week we heard the story of Jacob, his deceits and trickery in depriving his older twin brother Esau of both his birthright and their father's blessing. We examined the nature of divine manifestations in dreams to Jacob that eventually transformed him into a man convinced that God would protect him, no matter where he went or what happened. And you may remember that when he encountered the angel in a dream, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Later, he became the father of 12 sons, from which emerged the 12 tribes of Israel. This week, we embark on the saga of Joseph in the book of Genesis. Now, this self-contained narrative is based on ancient legends, but it was completely refashioned by Israelite narrators to create a deeply moving story of sibling rivalry and betrayal, salvation, forgiveness, and transformation that provided a history for an outstanding Israelite ancestor. There's a wide range of human emotion and passion and action in this legend. It's really more than a legend. It's actually a dramatic novella, so modern in its portrayal of the twists and turns of the human psyche that it continues to shock and astound us. Joseph was the elder son of Jacob by his second and preferred wife, Rachel. He was the son of Jacob's old age, and Jacob, Israel, loved him dearly. According to the narrator, Joseph was an exceptionally handsome young man of 17, and much favored over his 11 other brothers by his father Jacob, much as Jacob himself had been favored by his mother over his twin brother Esau. Jacob gave Joseph a magnificent coat with long sleeves, the kind worn by a prince who did no work. It certainly was not like the simple tunic his brothers wore in the fields as shepherds. Like his father, Joseph was a natural mystic, one gifted by God to have prophetic dreams. But unlike his father, he was also an interpreter of his own dreams and of the dreams of others. Such a gift of interpreting dreams was highly esteemed in the ancient world. Those who could recognize the import of dreams were regarded as seers, even prophets. Dreams were considered to be reliable predictions of good or ill fortune, and Joseph boasted, rather proudly, of his ability to interpret dreams. Now his 10 older brothers hated Joseph, not only because he was their father's favored son by a different mother, and because his father had given him the elegant long coat, but also because of his dreams, and because of his continual boasting about what he saw in his dreams. It was believed that once dreams were told, that is, spoken, the prophecy would become a reality. Joseph dreamed in silent pictures, without words to explain the meaning of what he saw. Unlike Jacob's dreams, there were no angelic appearances or even divine manifestations, and no verbal messages, but there were clear and distinct prophecies of the future. So we hear in the story that Joseph dreamt that he and his brothers were binding sheaves in a field, and lo, his sheaf arose and stood upright, and the brothers' sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to his sheaf. His brothers chided him, quote, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to have dominion over us?" And the brothers hated him even more. Joseph dreamed another dream. "Behold, 11 stars were bowing down to me," meaning the ancient notion of the 11 signs of the zodiac. When he told this dream to his father and his brothers, his father became incensed at the youth's presumption and rebuked him, quote, "What is this dream that you've dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" At this his brothers became even more jealous of him, and his father could not put the dream out of his mind. Some time later, the brothers were pasturing their flocks near Shechem, and Jacob sent Joseph several days' journey to visit them. Quote, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word again." Joseph set out, but when he couldn't find his brothers at Shechem, a man saw him wandering in the fields and asked who he was seeking. When he said he was looking for his brothers, the man said they'd moved on to Dothan. So Joseph went further to Dothan. And then we read the terrible words that set the entire tragedy in motion. Quote, "They, the brothers, saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, 'Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams.'" Here we see how the harboring of envy and jealousy can quickly turn to uncontrollable hate and the diabolic intent to commit a crime. But when Joseph's brother Reuben heard this murderous plan, he was determined to save Joseph from death. He told his brothers, quote, "Let us not take his life. Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. The pit was a dry cistern, a large hole carved out of the soil to store the winter rainwater for the hot, dry summer. Reuben pointed out a particular pit or cistern that he knew was empty. We may imagine Joseph's helpless struggle with his brothers as he was stripped of his robe and carried to the pit naked, kicking and screaming, and thrown into the deep darkness. And then we read a sentence that shocks. Quote, "Then they," that is the brothers, "sat down to eat." Such callousness and cruelty succinctly characterizes the hard-heartedness of the brothers, all but Reuben. Well, soon after, the brothers look up and they see, quote, a caravan of traders coming from Gilead with their camels, carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him, and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. So they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" And then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." The father recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his own garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned his son for many days. And Jacob refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol," that is, the land of the dead, "to my son mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. This first act in the saga of Joseph depicts a family torn apart by jealousy, hatred, and a monstrous crime. As one scholar wrote, quote, "The beginning of Joseph's story is still under the shadow of Jacob, Israel's guilt, which had clung to the old man since his youth. Just as he once deceived his father and robbed his brother whom his father loved more than him, so he is now deceived by his sons who have shoved his favorite son to one side." Looking ahead, the narrative is a clear exposition of the following drama. All the chief characters, Jacob, Israel, Judah, and Joseph, appear. Indeed, the chain of guilt and suffering, as in a Greek tragedy, continues in this family story. Joseph is sold to a high official in the service of Pharaoh. He is given the duties of house overseer, a position of great trust. Quote, "His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and the master made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. And from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and in field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate." Now, the reason the narrator gives for this surprising turn of events is that Yahweh was with Joseph, protecting him in his exile and causing everything he touched to prosper. At the same time, Joseph is greatly humbled. He learns to be subservient to handle responsibility and to become industrious. So he seems to have a much brighter future. However, there's a dark side. The wife of Potiphar lusts after him and flagrantly tempts Joseph to take her to bed. Joseph refuses to commit adultery, as it would be a great wickedness against her husband, as well as a grave sin against God. Joseph will not dishonor his earthly master or his heavenly Lord. Joseph's fear of the Lord, that is, his reverence for Yahweh, and his strict adherence to divine commands, binds him to moral behavior. Further, Joseph argues that it is a matter of universal human decency. He cannot break the trust that his master has confided in him. Adultery was always considered in Israel to be one of the most serious of all sins, punishable by death. Whoever broke the marriage contract by indulging in sexual relations with a married woman betrayed one of the most sacred commands of Yahweh. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce the youth Joseph when they are alone in the house, and when he refuses her advances yet again, she grabs his tunic and he runs off naked. This is the second time Joseph is stripped of his clothing. And then we hear, quote, "When the wife of Potiphar saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, 'See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment with me and fled outside.' Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you've brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside.'" So once again, Joseph is betrayed, this time by his master's wife. Of course, when Potiphar hears his wife's story, he is enraged and condemns Joseph to prison. Now Joseph has been reduced from a slave in charge of his master's house to a slave in the service of prisoners in a dungeon. Yet in spite of this drastic turn of events, Joseph was not alone. Quote, "The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." Again, to the narrator, divine protection did not mean that Joseph would be free from persecution, from injustice, and from great distress. But it did mean that he would always be protected by Yahweh in the midst of whatever tribulation befell him. We must remember this in our own lives right now. Whatever we must go through, to suffer, to endure, we are protected by divine providence. We must always hope for, and yes, anticipate, a sudden turn of events, a transformation that is about to occur. God will never forsake those who trust in him. And now the stage is set for the next scene that is all about dreams. Joseph is made to serve two prisoners, the royal cupbearer and the royal baker, very high officials of Pharaoh's court. They each have dreams that they believe are prophecies about their own future, but they are at a complete loss as to how to understand the meaning of the dreams. They consider the interpretation of dreams to be an earthly science, and if they had been free, there were plenty of wise men at court who would have interpreted the dreams for them. But they are in prison. And then they hear about Joseph's gifts, and they seek Joseph's help. But Joseph answers that, quote, interpretations belong to God. That is, he fully recognizes that his gift of interpretation is not a human art or magical science, but a divine charisma. So Joseph hears the royal cupbearer's dream and predicts that within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up the cupbearer's head and restore him to office, and he shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as he used to do. Joseph begs the cupbearer to remember him when he returns to court and mention him to Pharaoh to get him out of prison. Quote, for in fact I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. But Joseph interprets the baker's dream to mean that in 3 days' time the baker's head will also be lifted up, but from him. That is, he will be hanged and decapitated for his crimes. And indeed, it came to pass that the cupbearer was restored to Pharaoh's court, and the baker was executed for his crimes. Unfortunately for Joseph, the cupbearer neglected to remember his request to ask pardon from Pharaoh. 2 more years pass, and now Pharaoh himself is having alarming dreams that the court magicians and wise men cannot interpret. The royal cupbearer now remembers the Hebrew man in prison and recommends Joseph as an interpreter of dreams. So Pharaoh calls upon Joseph. Quote, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, oh, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. And then 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ugly and thin. Never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. And the thin and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had done so, for they were still as ugly as before. And then I awoke. I fell asleep a second time, and I saw in my dream 7 ears of grain, full and good, growing up on one stalk, and 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouting after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. But when I told it to the magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me. And then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land because of the famine that will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. And that food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Recognizing that Joseph has a divine gift and is a natural-born leader, Pharaoh sets the former prisoner over his whole household and the land of Egypt, and commands all the people to follow his orders. Only Pharaoh will be above Joseph, who is now the Grand Vizier, the authorized representative of the king himself, director of the palace, and the most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh gives Joseph his own signet ring, has him arrayed in fine linen clothes, and puts a golden chain of authority around his neck. From now on, Joseph will ride in the 2nd chariot right behind Pharaoh, and all will bow down before him. Pharaoh also gave Joseph the daughter of the high priest in marriage, with whom he will have 2 sons. Thus, at the age of 30, Joseph has gained authority over the land of Egypt. Yahweh has turned around his fortunes, most suddenly and fortuitously. Years pass, and the prophecies come true. 7 years of plenty are followed by 7 years of extreme famine. But because of Joseph's advanced planning, grain was stored, and people from all over came to buy or barter grain from the royal silos. Quote, "And since the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine became severe throughout the whole world." We see here a parable for our own time of pandemic and famine and persecution, and a certain ending of the way we've been living, yet not knowing how it will be in the future. Joseph, notice, was an interpreter of dreams and a gifted prophet, but he was also able to give sound practical advice based on his interpretation of the dreams. In other words, Joseph was a wise spiritual counselor. He not only explained the meaning of mystical encounters in dreams, but he made clear that the impending years of plenty and famine demanded an immediate human response. Isn't that the situation in which we find ourselves during the ongoing pandemic and increasing famine? Leaders must always take drastic measures to avert an inevitable tragedy. It is one thing to have prophecies and even statistical predictions of what is bound to happen in the future, but it's quite another thing to chart a wise and prudent course of action, no matter how difficult, that will actually save lives. And this is why we need wise, spiritually mature leaders. We look to leaders to devise a workable plan and then see that it is carried out. We must pray that God will send us such leaders. And we must also take responsibility ourselves for recognizing how God is speaking to us personally, whether through our dreams or in the waking state. And through our meditation practice, we must listen every day, ever more deeply, in the silence, and wait ever more patiently, so that we can hear the call of what the Spirit wants us to do. And if we cannot understand the message or interpret the intuitions that we have, then we too must seek the advice of a wise spiritual counselor. And then, like Joseph, we must be willing to act on that advice. Let us take this into a guided meditation now. Allow a wave of relaxation to flow over your head, down your neck and shoulders, your arms, hands, your chest and abdomen and legs and feet. Become aware of your breath. Don't try to control it. Just be aware of it. Is it long? Is it short? Just stay with the breath for a while. And become aware of the thoughts passing before your inner eyes. They're like dreams, really. Waking dreams. In our thoughts we remember, we imagine, we dream of the future. We make plans. We fear some things. We wish for others. Just watch these thoughts now as they arise. Do not try to engage with them. Or control them. Merely watch them and let them go one by one. As you exhale, breathe them out into the sky. And likewise with emotions that may arise. You don't have to become involved with them. You can let them go too. Simply be aware of them and realize they are not you. And now draw back deeper into awareness itself, as if dropping down, down, down into your own soul. Be still. And listen in the silence. Become aware of the divine awareness that enables you to be aware. The divine awareness that is pure love. Here is where you may take refuge. Here is where your own security and true safety lie. Here is the divine presence that will never leave you unprotected or alone. Give thanks that you have been cared for and carried through all the tragedies and triumphs of your own life, just like Joseph. And make an act of trust that the same divine love that gives you life and sustains your breath every nanosecond will continue to bless and protect you, whatever is to be. Amen. Please be sure to subscribe to these weekly Life, Love, and Light podcasts and share them with your family and friends who may need reassurance of divine protection right now. And for those of you who wish to go deeper into the stories of biblical characters and mystics, may I recommend my own book, Suddenly There Is God, the story of our lives in sacred scripture, which won the 2020 Catholic Press Association Book Award for Scripture. The book is available from the publisher Cascade Books in paperback and as an ebook, and also, of course, on Amazon worldwide. And if you'd like more information about the book or wish to order it for yourself or for someone you love this Christmas, please visit my website, VeronicaMaryRolfe.com. Next week, we will delve into the story of Joseph and his brothers, who come to Egypt during the famine, seeking food. They encountered Joseph, the Grand Vizier, not knowing he is the very brother they sold into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. It is a heart-rending story of severe testing, transformation, recognition, and forgiveness. This saga of Joseph and his brothers speaks to us today as a strong example of faith and courage in times of crisis, just like our own. And it reveals yet again that God's protection will never abandon us, no matter how dire the circumstances. I hope you will join us next week. And until next week, I wish you all the blessings of divine life, love, and light.